Well, it's Sunday, April 14th, 2024, and it's the anniversary of the Titanic disaster once again. For those of you who don't know, my first ever video was a recipe for curried chicken and rice inspired by a second-class dinner menu on the Titanic, and while the Titanic still holds an intense fascination for me, I've actually been interested in the world of steamships and oceanliners ever since I was a little kid, with the Titanic kind of being the stepping stone for that interest. That being the case, I thought it might be fun to start sprinkling the channel with episodes inspired by menus from steamships and oceanliners, starting with this recipe for Székely Gulyás, a Hungarian pork and sauerkraut stew inspired by a menu from the RMS Carpathia, the ship that rescued the Titanic survivors. So if you're just here for a delicious Székely Gulyás recipe, feel free to jump ahead. I've got the timestamp in the video description. But for those of you who are interested, I'd like to share the story of the second most prominent ship in the Titanic saga, the RMS Carpathia. Constructed at the CS Swan and Hunter shipyards between 1901 and 1902 on behalf of the Cunard Line, rivals of Titanic's White Star Line, the Carpathia was originally intended as an intermediate liner to operate between Liverpool and Boston, carrying only second and third class passengers, also known as saloon class and steerage class respectively, as well as a significant amount of cargo. Soon after her maiden voyage on May 5, 1903, however, Carpathia began making runs between Liverpool and New York during the summer only, and operating between New York and ports in the Mediterranean during the winter. Although she would eventually be overshadowed by the likes of the Adriatic, Mauretania, and Olympic, at the time of her launch, Carpathia actually set quite a new standard for passenger comfort and shipboard amenities. In July of 1903, May Harris Anson, writer for the Minneapolis Journal and future World War I correspondent, traveled on the Carpathia from New York to Liverpool with a group of friends. In an article for the journal, she wrote, "The Carpathia is one of the largest ships afloat, and she is the best of her class. The staterooms of the saloon passengers are much better than some of the staterooms on the large, fast boats, and the steerage accommodations are far ahead of any other boat so far." During the voyage, Anson was also taken on a tour of steerage class, where she noted that although the third-class accommodations and food offerings were simpler than in saloon class, there are parlors for men and women, lighted by portholes, and there is quite as much deck room for them as the saloon passengers, and the piano in their dining saloon just as good as the one that has its place in the saloon above, meaning the second-class dining saloon. In fact, looking at illustrations of Carpathia's third-class smoking and sitting rooms and second-class cabins, in comparing equivalent rooms on board Titanic and her sister ship Olympic, the Carpathias don't appear to be drastically inferior to the newer luxury liners. It would seem then Miss Anson was right when she wrote, "Altogether, the Carpathia has set a new pace in her general accommodations for her passengers, whether steerage or saloon." In 1904, the Cunard Line won a rate war against German shipping lines, and in a partnership with the Hungarian Adria Line, became essentially the only company to provide immigrants with service from the port of Fiume, Austria-Hungary, now Rijeka, Croatia. And from this point on, one of the Carpathia's primary duties would be to carry Hungarian immigrants across the Atlantic, as well as functioning as essentially a cruise ship in the Mediterranean and Adriatic, stopping at ports such as Naples, Genoa, Alexandria, Algiers, and Gibraltar. In 1905, she underwent a renovation, adding first-class accommodations, which in actuality were just former second-class areas, and new public spaces were constructed for second-class passengers, and third-class capacity was increased by converting former cargo space into passenger cabins. By 1912, Carpathia had a capacity of 2,450 passengers, 250 in first and second class, and 2,200 in third class, 300 crew, and had maintained her popularity, not only because of her comfortable staterooms and well-appointed public spaces, but her wide keel and low, well-balanced superstructure made for famously steady sailing, even in rough seas. On April 11, 1912, the Carpathia set sail from New York en route to Austria-Hungary under the command of Captain Arthur Rostron, a 17-year veteran of the Cunard Line, carrying 743 passengers and 240 crew. Interestingly, one of Carpathia's first-class passengers, Charles H. Marshall of New York, had three nieces traveling on the Titanic, Charlotte Appleton, Caroline Lane Brown, and Malvina Helen Cornell. They all survived. Just after midnight on April 15th, Carpathia's lone wireless telegraph operator, Harold Cottam, decided that, even though he was done working for the night, he would take a listen to the wireless traffic before going to bed. It was then that he heard the distress signal from the Titanic, which had struck an iceberg about 40 minutes earlier. After confirming Titanic's location, Cottam rushed to Carpathia's bridge and delivered the distress message. Captain Rostron, who was off duty at the time, was quickly awakened and informed of Titanic's distress call. He immediately gave the order to head for Titanic's last reported coordinates, shutting down the ship's heating and hot water systems to make more steam available for the engines, and posting extra lookouts to avoid suffering the same fate as the ship they were racing to assist. At 4 a.m., after sailing for several hours at full speed, dodging icebergs along the way, Carpathia arrived at the Titanic's last reported location. Unfortunately, this was too late for the over 1,500 people who had either drowned or succumbed to hypothermia when the Titanic went under. By 9 a.m., the just over 700 Titanic survivors had been brought on board. They were given blankets and hot food by Carpathia's crew, provided with places to sleep. Captain Rostron gave up his own cabin to several survivors, and were even provided clothing from Carpathia's passengers. After arriving in New York, Captain Rostron and Carpathia's crew were rightly lauded as heroes by both the Titanic survivors and the general public. Regular crew members were awarded bronze medals, officers silver medals, and survivor Margaret Brown, only known as Unsinkable Molly after her death, by the way, personally presented Captain Rostron with a silver cup and gold medal. The Carpathia would continue to service her regular routes for several more years until the outbreak of World War I, when she was used to carry Canadian and later American troops across the Atlantic, as well as a small number of paying passengers. On July 15, 1918, the Carpathia left Liverpool as part of a convoy bound for Boston, with 57 passengers and 166 crew, under the command of Captain William Prothero. 2 days later, on July 17th, she was hit with 2 torpedoes by the German U-boat U-55. Although 5 crewmen were killed instantly by the torpedo hits, the rest of Carpathia's passengers and crew were able to safely evacuate, with Captain Prothero and several officers even having time to destroy confidential documents on board before being the last to leave the fatally wounded ship. After 1 hour and 45 minutes, Carpathia, the heroic rescue ship of the Titanic disaster, sank beneath the waves. The surviving passengers and crew were rescued by the Royal Navy's HMS Snowdrop and returned to Liverpool. As for the RMS Carpathia herself, she now lies in 500 feet of water, about 120 miles off the coast of Ireland. Thankfully for our culinary exploration, a number of menus seem to have survived from the Carpathia from various voyages, so this may be just the first time we try out a Carpathian meal. The menu for today is a second-class tea menu from Wednesday, September 6th, 1911. At first glance, I thought some of the dishes sounded a little heavy for tea time, but being American and not knowing anything about tea, I did some research. And what I found was that the term tea or high tea was sometimes used to refer to an evening meal. This is backed up by menus from other Cunard ships that also show relatively heavy, savory foods for tea. In fact, the 1903 Minneapolis Journal article I quoted earlier describes tea as being served on the Carpathia between 9 and 10 p.m., which seems really late, but what do I know? I wasn't there. I chose this menu and this dish because I had never heard of Székely Gulyás before, and in fact, pronounced it Székely Gulyás until I learned better. But the name popped out at me, and once I found out what it was, I thought it sounded pretty good, especially because I am a pretty big paprika guy. Now, if paprika, pork chops, and goulash seems like kind of strange offerings, not just for tea, but for a British passenger liner in general, remember that the Carpathia carried a lot of people traveling either to or from Hungary and East Central Europe, so serving dishes with a Hungarian flair kind of seems like a sensible move. This particular voyage was New York bound, so the menus seemed to invoke cuisines from places the passengers had just been rather than where they were going to. Regardless, whether you were a Hungarian traveling on the Carpathia or just a vacationer not quite ready to go back to Anglo-American dishes, it probably would have been a nice surprise to see Székely Gulyás on the menu, goulash being one of the signature dishes of Hungary, and this particular variety being named for Hungarian writer József Székely, who apparently went to one of his favorite restaurants late one night. The chef had to kind of whip something together on the fly, and thus was born Székely Gulyás. While many people in North America may be unfamiliar with this dish, it's been popular since the late 1800s in Hungary, where it's also known as Székely kaposta, or Székely cabbage. It's also very popular in southern Germany, and in fact, aside from one very basic Hungarian recipe written in the 1880s, all of the period recipes that I found were written in German. Like with the Titanic curried chicken, there are no recipes for the steamships from the early 20th century, but I was able to find a number of contemporary cookbooks, again, all in German, that had recipes for Székely Gulyás, or in German, Székely Gulyás. It's from these early 1900s cookbooks that I've based my recipe on, most heavily from a recipe submitted by Ms. Mary Meyer-Eigen to the 1916 cookbook, Cooking Recipes Furnished by Prominent Men and Women at Home and Abroad. The book is interesting. It's made up of recipes contributed by just various people, some recipes in English, most in German, and it was published by the German and Austro-Hungarian Aid Society of Chicago. So the contributors are probably citizens of those countries, Germany and Austria-Hungary, or American citizens of German and Austrian descent. So, to make my Carpathia Székely Gulyás, you're going to take 2 to 2.5 pounds of pork shoulder cut into bite-sized cubes, 6 tablespoons of lard, or cooking oil or butter, whatever you're using, 2 medium yellow onions, diced, 1.5 teaspoons of salt, 2 teaspoons of black pepper, 2 tablespoons of Hungarian paprika. The 2 most common types of Hungarian paprika are sweet and half-sharp. Sweet is mild, half-sharp is spicier. None of the recipes that I've found say if you're supposed to use sweet over half-sharp, although I suspect that sweet was probably the default in 1911. That being said, I'm doing a 3-to-1 ratio of sweet to half-sharp, but you can go ahead and change that up however you want. 2 teaspoons of ground caraway seeds, 2 teaspoons of marjoram, 2 teaspoons of thyme, 3 to 5 fresh bay leaves, depending on their size, 4 to 5 garlic cloves. These can be chopped, minced, smashed, however you want. 4 tablespoons of flour, 1.5 cups of sour cream, 4 pounds of sauerkraut. You could use less if you want a less krauty gulyás, but I used 4 pounds, and water. Heat the lard, or whatever fat you're cooking with, in a large pot or Dutch oven over medium heat. Add the diced onions and sauté until they're starting to turn translucent. Add the meat. Cook for about 10 minutes. You're not going to get a great sear or any sear at all, but that's all right. There's going to be plenty of flavor once we're done. This might seem kind of odd, but pretty much every recipe from 1891 onward has you cooking the onions first, then adding the meat. Add the paprika, herbs, and garlic, and cook for 1 minute, stirring to make sure the paprika doesn't burn. Add enough water to about 3/4 cover everything, which for me was about 2 cups, and then bring to a simmer. Cover, turn the heat down to low, and keep simmering, stirring occasionally and adding more water if needed. After about 30 to 40 minutes, rinse and squeeze out the sauerkraut. Doesn't need to be perfectly dry, of course, but we're trying to make sure that our sauerkraut isn't way too sour. Stir in the sauerkraut, add a little water if necessary, and simmer for another 20 minutes. Then take the flour and sour cream, mix them together until smooth. Stir this mixture into the pot and simmer for another 10 minutes. All total, your goulash should cook for about an hour to an hour and 20 minutes. You can serve as is, or spoon another dollop of sour cream on top if you wish. Just make sure you got something to sop up that delicious broth, like dumplings or even some nice soft bread. Now you're ready to imagine you're on the Carpathia, headed through the Mediterranean, enjoying a delicious bowl of Székely Gulyás. It's hearty, a little spicy depending on how much half-sharp paprika you used, and an all-around great dish that I've added to our regular rotation since I started testing our recipes for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you're interested in learning more about the Carpathia, everyone's friend Mike Brady over at the Oceanliner Designs channel has some great videos to check out, so I'll link to those in the description, as well as some videos taken from the wreck of the Carpathia back in 2007. I really hope you enjoyed this Székely Gulyás recipe. If you give it a try, please let me know in the comments how it turned out. I'll have the full written recipe over at gen-EAT-alogy.com. Please don't forget to like, comment, and or subscribe, and I'll see you next time on Gen-EAT-alogy.